3, 2, 1.
Very glad to be in Los Angeles right now as an art maker, as an artist.
I'm here in New York today talking to Michel Delsol and Joe Lamport, and today we're talking about a book that you guys collaborated on called The Life and Times of Richard Musto. So my first question is, what was the impetus for the book?
Well, the impetus for the book was actually a random encounter that took place probably less than 100 yards from where we're sitting, the corner of this block, 28th Street and 6th Avenue, where one night as I was coming home from work, I ran into this old man who had camped out there on the corner. So really, I guess the best way to describe the impetus was it was just a random occurrence.
And what was it about that occurrence that made you want to take this encounter with Richard Musto further into a creative practice?
Well, that's a very complicated and multi-layered question. So I'd say from the very first moment, there was not necessarily a conscious decision to go further. There was just a conscious decision to have a conversation with this old man, and he had certain very obvious, curious characteristics that really intrigued me and drew me to him, just as a matter of human interest as much as anything else. And there was a immediately remarkable quality about the fact that here was a man who at that time was 87 years old, who was evidently living on the street. And that to me was a remarkable and noteworthy thing, because I've lived in New York City more or less my whole life. And I'd never really encountered or seen something like that. It's not unlike many other aspects of life in a city. You don't see dead pigeons that often, but they must be here, right? So what happens to homeless people as they get old? Here this man was in the flesh, and as I started to talk to him, discovered that he had some pretty interesting qualities. So it was really an accidental encounter that led to a quick acquaintance that then deepened and then grew into a formal decision, first on my part, but then extending that as an invitation to Michel to work with me and to see what we could do to document this man's life.
So specifically, what were the qualities that leapt out?
Well, a number of things, some personal, some more arcane. In a personal sense, one of the things that struck me and interested me was simply a generational reckoning that here was a man who was roughly my father's age, who by all appearances held himself out as a veteran of the Second World War, which my father also was. So I just sort of connected with him in that sense. In a deeper way, part of what struck me and quickly drew me into being very intrigued by Richard was a project that I had just was in the process of finishing at that time. In my experience and my creative work, the moment when you are just wrapping up one project, you're sort of at your most vulnerable stage in the creative process. What in fact happened was the book that I was in the process of just finishing, it was a work of translation, was on a theme that in some ways directly led me to into my relationship that started to form with Richard. That some of the qualities that I thought I saw in him were remarkably similar to the qualities in the project that I was just wrapping up. And that immediately kind of appealed to me and drew me in to get to know him further, simply because the book that I was just finishing was a historic, a rather remarkable text that had nothing to do with New York City, nothing to do with reality, nothing to do with anything resembling this old man, and I felt somehow strangely connected, strange connection nonetheless between the two projects.
So the decision then to involve Michel then in the book, where did that come from, and had you guys collaborated previously or associated at a professional level?
Well, we had briefly collaborated before because we'd done some work on the with Rose before, right? Yeah. So we had not produced any work, although we'd sort of had some shared interests, and Michel and I have known each other for a long time, and I've always loved his work, and I thought that visual documentation of Richard was just an important element of the story, because I thought there was something remarkable about this man and his life that would tend to be subject to disbelief if it was simply presented as a narrative. And that at the same time I just had a strong sense that Michel's aesthetic, to the extent that I was familiar with it, would likewise be that he would find Richard to be an interesting subject. So at first it was really casual. Just I think I called you and said, "Gee, can you come by? I'd like you to meet
I remember.
somebody."
So, could you come by? I'm working on writing about this person. Would you come by and take some photos? So I spent the first time with Joe. The first time Joe invited me over, probably was like 2 to 3 months, closer to 3 months into your own project.
I don't think it was that long.
You probably have a better
actually.
date on. Joe had already started the project, and he invited me over for basically, originally, from what I understood, just to take 1 or 2 photographs on one occasion. And at the end of that evening, that night, actually, the first time was a night, I was both fascinated by both Richard, but also at the same time I was equally as fascinated in a different way by the work that Joe was doing with Richard, or on Richard, with Richard. So then I'm not quite sure how the events went beyond that, but very quickly, the next time, I remember. So I think that Richard then, within a few days of me meeting Richard through Joe the first time, within a few days later, Joe called me and said, "Oh, Richard's no longer in New York, no longer at his corner," actually, that's more precise. So Joe and me met that evening and we photographed. We went and looked at his corner where Richard was living. He was no longer there. And a few days later, Joe knows that Richard was out in Atlantic City in New Jersey. So I guess it's spontaneously I decided to hook up with Joe when Joe was going to go. I sort of invited myself in a situation that was already sort of calling for me to ask to be there in some ways. That's the way I felt it. And for both reasons, both for Richard, but also for the work that Joe was doing with Richard. So it was like it started becoming three-dimensional in terms of the way all of us could be with each other. It wasn't just a narrative of Joe with Richard. It was that, but then it was like a meta level of the narrative being part of the core narrative at the same time, with a consciousness that all three of us knew. Richard, he himself had been a photographer for many years. So we were all extremely aware that we were both working. Joe was writing at the first degree, but also was writing about the writing.
Because I was going to ask Joe, your text is poetic. You're a poet. Do
Well,
you,
sort of.
yeah.
You know. I occasionally rhyme words. You know.
Yeah, but I mean, its presentation is much more poetic than
not.
prose. Yeah. And Michel, did you feel coming into this project with Joe that your job was, well, what did you feel your job was? Was it to document, or was it to also take a more poetic approach to photographing Richard?
Well, I think that it's pretty parallel to what Joe is doing in terms of, I think that both the documentation and the poetry were just one thing. It was just, part of it was, I think it was a good mix. I think part of it was that our subject itself was quite outside of the ordinary, and I think that both perhaps Joe's natural way of being, of working, and my natural way of being and working would make it that any kind of documentation, any facts would also be approached in a poetic way, which means in a free form, in a way that would allow multiple perspectives to be in the subject at the same time. Although it was very controlled and it was done in a conscious manner, it allowed for multiple levels of perspective on both subject and the thing that was actually happening, the project, the book that was actually happening at the same time. So,
Joe, how do you think without the photographs, the text would have been different?
Well, in truth, the text itself may not have been that different in that I just simply wrote the book. Now, in writing the book, I did have access to a lot of Michel's photographs because this was a collaboration that happened over a period of 2 years, really, from the time that we first met Richard to when we, is it 2.5 years?
2.5 years, maybe to the very end. Yeah.
So a lot of Michel's work was available to me throughout. So there are references in the book to specific photographs and images that I knew that Michel had captured that I wanted to be part of the book. So yes, the photography is important to elements of the text, but I in many ways I feel like Michel's work ran parallel to my work, rather than it's not like writing a screenplay with another writer in the sense that you butt heads and argue about every line or structure or organization. That Michel ceded the sort of narrative task to me, and I ceded the visual presentation to him, where the collaboration in some ways became most alive was when it came to the task of organizing the book and figuring out the order of presentation and really how the finished product would look. And then alternatively, when we put together some short video pieces where we actively had to collaborate in terms of process. But I would know more. Occasionally I might suggest to Michel, gee, wouldn't that make an interesting picture? Just as he might point out something to me about what Richard had said or something that had happened that I would take note of. But other than that, I think in our individual work we were we managed to be self-directed and self-organizing.
I feel that completely. I feel that I don't think any of the writing has been changed. I mean, I'm not saying that an accent or this, but I think all the writing, all the organizational plan of the book, even though it might not have been completely set at the beginning, because part of it became as it was going. But I don't think that the photography had anything to do with the course of Joe's development of his thematic. And of course, it did not have to do anything with the inception, the beginning of the project, which was Joe's interest encounter with Richard, and then his very quick interest in Richard as a subject. So we worked sort of both parallel, and there was no brief. I didn't get, this is Joe's project, but I didn't get a brief from Joe. It was just more like sort of being in both parallel plans, but also that sort of intermesh in completely open ways.
Yeah, but part of that, you didn't get a brief because we know each other and we're friends, right? So I feel like we were able to operate effectively and collaborate effectively together without a formal structure in place. Whereas I think if I had gone out and hired someone as a photographer that I didn't know or have a prior relationship with, it would have been a much more formal process in which maybe we would have had to have gone through my explaining what the project was about. But you, from the moment you came by that first night and met Richard and saw him on the street, you understood what this was about, and it didn't require any, then it just all had to unfold and happen for both of us without further, in that sense, we always talked about whose project it was or whatever.
Right.
It was both of our project in the way that it unfolded. I always felt that we were absolutely doing this work together. And you were always very
I was always careful to make sure that the project was conceived and incepted by Joe. So this is Joe's project subject, which I was really happy to write along and be part of as well.
But it very much is a collaboration, isn't it?
And as Joe said, in the development, it was an open collaboration.
Yeah.
I've always sort of, but then the inception and the original conception of the project is Joe's. And I've mentioned this a few times, although Joe has completely left me open, very free on this. I've always left the last, if very few times, but anytime there might have been a decision to be made, I've always felt very comfortable that this is Joe's project and this is Joe's directed. Let Joe make the mistakes, and I'll ride shotgun on his mistakes. But I have no problem. It's fine. I'm absolutely very comfortable with that because it's a great project.
Well, part of how that works is that in the collaboration, because we are bringing very different elements to the work, so that and Michel has a background that's very different from mine, and in some ways much more informed by a lot more of a foundation in aesthetics and French philosophy, and which is not particularly part of my background, but those things prove to be very important values in a project like this that has a meta level to it. So I just felt that our skills and our interests were very well complemented one another for purposes of making this happen.
They're complementary, but more than complementary, they actually mutually build up each other. Actually, so it's not just we stayed at the same status. And we actually ended up, growing in this project. Our craft and our art grew.
Our obsession.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's almost like the thing about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. That it's not just simply a matter of complementing, but something else happens in that collaboration.
But that requires a lot of discipline. It requires a lot of both group discipline as well as individual discipline for this freedom to always be able to be at a good level.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you find in collaborating that there are certain things that you have to give up? From both of your point of view, it's Joe's project, and I likewise have collaborated with an artist where it was the artist project, and I was in a similar case to you, Michel, sort of brought in to add something to that, to work with it. But there is something, I don't mean give up in a negative sense, but did you find that there were things that...
Well, we're temperamentally different.
Yeah.
Michel is a perfectionist by instinct, and and that's turns out to be an very important part of a project like this, whereas I'm a slob and much more of a...
So you like The Odd Couple? The original
Yeah,
one?
there's something of
Yeah,
The Odd
yeah.
Couple about us. But that...
Normally, the photographer is a clean one, right? but Joe is an amazing workaholic. Joe can put in an amount of work that is amazing. That's
well, but
truckloads of work.
those, I'm much more of a rough draft person, and so one of the good things about working with Michel on this project is that it pushed me to be much more inclined to keep going, to try to hone, refine, and bring the quality of the writing up to what I thought the quality of the visual imagery was as well. So there's a good dynamic at work that way when you start playing off of someone else's creative energy, but the frustrating part can be there are times when Michel's perfectionism would drive me mad, and those times those times more happened when we were working on the video probably than anything else, where you wanted to get the cut.
Yeah, there's
exactly.
there's no reason for it not to be the way I want it to be.
but I would, that's the kind of thing that my impulses would be to blow through, look for something that's a little bit less perfect, only because my sense is, well, what's the end product going to be used for? It's not going to be shown theatrically. This is just something we're going to dump on a Kickstarter campaign.
So the video is the video that you had on Kickstarter. That was...
Well, we ended up
more
doing
than that.
two.
Yeah.
We did one for Kickstarter, and then
Yeah.
we did another one for some other reason. I forget what. But
And but the video is obviously successful in its aim, because because I wanted to ask you about this as well, with the whole crowdsourcing idea with the funding. You were aiming at, I think, raising, was it $4,000 or $5,000?
yeah, I think our threshold was 4,000, and we
You
ended up
raised
raising
it back
about
more,
5.5%.
We did 150%, and for the first 3 days we did like 3%. Then from day 3 to day 6 we did 150%.
Yeah.
Then from day 7 till the end we plateaued at 161%.
Right.
Well, it was a worthwhile experience. I'm not necessarily a big fan of Kickstarter for all creative projects, but for something like this that mixed media and has a lot of different elements to it, it enabled us to, if it was just a straightforward book, a narrative, I don't think Kickstarter necessarily has a place. First of all, you don't really have the same funding issues or problems, but we wanted to produce a nice looking hardcover book, so we couldn't really do that, and we wanted to get somebody very talented involved to help us with the layout and the formatting of it. So there were certain complicating factors which led us to want to get money and not have to go out of pocket for doing it. And I think that the crowdsourcing does lend itself very well to projects like this. The joke of it is that Kickstarter or whatever platform you're working with doesn't do anything for you. They just provide you with a place where you can go out and use their tools to go and bother your friends to try to get money. So it still comes down to your burden to go and raise the money. But that being said, it still is an avenue. It was nice to be able to, in effect, raise the equivalent of what we might have gotten as an advance from a publisher if we've been lucky enough to find a publisher for the project, and to at least have part of the cost of a venture like this underwritten by people that we know.
So the Kickstarter funding allowed for the hardcover book, which was an abridged version of the later softcover. Is that right?
Correct. The way we kind of approached it is we thought, well, we'll just initially. We had no idea what was really going to happen as we tried to publish this. We were maybe hopeful that we would find a commercial publisher at some point. So our first goal was to produce what we thought was a hardcover book to as high a degree of
everything,
of as an aesthetic standard as possible. So we wanted a layout that really optimized the way the photos and text work together on the page, because that to us was part of the value of the whole collaboration. Is we wanted something that kind of had a, so in a sense it's more like in the U.S. market at least, it's really only children's books that are produced that way, where you see a kind of a direct correlation between the look and feel and the text. That's what we wanted to create, and we knew that a commercial publisher would never indulge us in that idiocy, so we had to do it ourselves. We didn't really know what kind of a paperback, when we came around to publishing the full text, we didn't quite have our kind of approach figured out when we did the Kickstarter campaign. And in that sense, a project like this in part involves a certain amount of experimentation, because we produced books before. I'd self-published paperbacks before that were plain text without any imagery, and Michel had self-published his photo books using iBook or
it's a similar thing. Yeah, I've also done a few very commercial books there.
But we had never had the experience of trying to produce on our own something that in effect could be produced at a low enough price point that we could effectively try to inject it into the stream of commerce, if you will. So part of the process, at least very much for me, of this whole experience was at least trying to learn enough about the economics of publishing so that we could end up producing a paperback without going broke. That would be at the cost of production would be such that we could sell it for $10 and still make a profit.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of doing the self-publish as opposed to if you've gone to a commercial?
Well, we would never have found a publisher for a project like this up front. That's just reality. And I wouldn't have wanted to be burdened by having to sell it up front. I always believe that the work is the thing that matters and it's the most important, so that our responsibility is to create the work and worry after it's created about what the fuck to do with it, right? You don't want to, and I know many intelligent creative people who think that doing a book of any sort starts by writing a proposal and trying to find an agent and then trying to find a proposal. Why would you put yourself at the mercy of that ridiculous process if there's something that you want to say? Just figure out what it is you want to say and do it, and you can always just bury it in the closet when you're done, but that's a decision you should make after the fact, after the creative act is complete. So
actually, we also really enjoy producing the book ourselves. It was sort of a natural continuation of the research or the work in itself. In terms of we were already gone in our trajectory of having to answer to the subject itself and not to anything, anybody, any business outside of this trio of Joe, Richard, and me. And then that's interesting in terms of producing the content. And then in terms of making the distribution, to actually produce the book and for the raising of the funds and the business parts of it, the distribution, all of that. I agree with Joe. I don't think a sane publisher would have published us, perhaps. But on the other hand, I know that it would have been a rare publisher in any case that would have put in the care and the attention that we put in to making it come out the way that we really wanted it to come out. So the whole thing is coherent. Both, so that's one of the advantages. It's coherent from the very beginning to the very end in terms of the same personality, the same mental thinking. That is the foundation, the curiosity that led Joe to be interested in Richard. The fact that Richard, Joe, and me kind of can sort of dance together for 2.5 years to do this project. That then finishes off in us producing the book. We've always enjoyed this sort of self-development, self-definition, and self-responsibility and freedom with a small f that this has allowed us, and allowed us also in the purpose of getting something that is good at the end to our own standards, and that is, it's coherent because we never let the control out.
But there are compromises
all the time.
in the
often.
final product.
Yes.
Driven by the fact that one
Money,
of my
deadline,
overriding
sure.
goals was to end up being able to produce a paperback that we could produce at a
price
reasonable
point,
cost.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, even though we've, in a sense, failed commercially because we haven't been able to sell many books, I feel like, in a sense, we succeeded commercially by at least making the book available, right? Available in a form and in a mode of presentation that we both feel really good about. And that there's a lot of the back and forth and the tension in our collaboration over the course of the project had to do with that, because whether we would produce, Michel's photographs are beautiful color photographs. One of the things that occurred to me early on is the cheapest way to be able to produce the book would be more in the manner of a graphic novel. And Michel feels very strongly about not taking his images and photoshopping them, or basically
them.
changing the nature of the image as he captured it. And I realized, maybe I could have set out to do this book as a graphic novel, and I would love to see this book as a graphic novel in some ways, because Richard he's a R. Crumb character come to life, or an American Splendor character in many ways. He really is steeped in that aesthetic. That's not Michel's aesthetic, and that really would be a disservice to his art to produce the book that way. So we had to come up with a way to produce something that had color imagery in it, but didn't break the bank. And I really liked the compromise that we ended up with, where we were able to insert a spread of some of the best color images in the paperback book, but use black and white versions of the photographs otherwise throughout. And that led us in further ways to look and to try to bring in some materials beyond Michel's photographs. So an important part of this book is that it really is a three-way collaboration, and that's not necessarily evident from the title, but really from the start, I think Michel and I were very aware that we were collaborating with Richard as well. What that meant to me, at least, and I think to Michel as well, is not that we wanted to give Richard in any way final say over anything that's in the book. And there are things in the book that he very much objects to or does take exception with. So we're the authors and the publishers, so we've retained that right for ourselves. But we wanted something that Richard actively participated in. So there's a lot of his own artwork that's incorporated into the book. A lot of his own words are incorporated in the book. And of course, he's very much the subject of all the photographs and the center of attention of the camera's lens.
You're the writer's pen.
Yeah. So, and we decided at some point along the way, this was an easy decision to make since we never really made any money from the project, that we also wanted to make Richard our, equal collaborator, to the extent that, when Hollywood knocks and decides that it's time to make the definitive version of the movie version of the story, that Richard would be able to share equally in any outlandish revenue that ever came in. So that to us was kind of important to the overall nature of the project. That not saying that we wanted to give him control, but we wanted him to feel that he had a stake in it in a way.
By allowing Richard this, it also gave us that much more space to move, because we felt we weren't sort of like sitting on top of him, or overusing him, or he's getting in. He was an equal partner in all the upside.
So how many times and over what period of time did you meet with him, and what was?
I kept track of.
So I have a record of all my photo shoots. So
Yeah.
So I could probably, I think the main period, which covers 2 years. There were probably close to 28 encounters in which I was part of. Now, over a period of 2 years, there are a number of times where Joe met Richard, either because he was at the corner on 28th Street, or because sometimes Joe would visit him, sometimes Richard would be in a VA, Veterans Hospital, sometimes Joe would go to New Jersey. So let's say there's 28 over a period of 2 years, in addition to which there are anywhere from 5 to 10 probably being closer number, that Joe has met with Richard when both of them were together.
Well, I would say it a little bit different. I think Michel's accuracy is, I'm certainly not going to question that there were formally 28 sessions, but those would be sessions where I called Michel and asked him to come over, or we took a trip together to Atlantic City to visit Richard in the room that he was living in down there. So, but I would say beyond those formal sessions, over the course of that 2.5 years, that not a week went by that I wasn't in touch with Richard in one way or the other. If he was here in New York, I would see him 2 or 3 times in the course of the week. Sometimes it was just to stop and say hi to him on the corner on my way home. Sometimes, we would go and have dinner together, and I spent thousands of hours with a man over the course of those 2.5 years, I'd say. And I will say this candidly in front of the camera, I'm really happy he's not living in New York right now, because I need to get my old life back, which was kind of impossible while he was on the corner. So.
Now, I just wanted to ask a question individually to you both about your practice, which is very different, of course, because Michel, you're a photographer, and Joe, you're a writer. But this is something that I often ask of artists, which is, to what extent is the process of creating part of the thinking process? And I'll probably get you to answer first, Michel.
Oh, I was going to defer to Joe to answer first, but well, and we talked about it at the beginning in terms of there's a couple of elements I want to put together, so then we can start talking about it more. One is, there was a basic framework, which was Joe's interest in Richard, and then Joe starting his poetic narrative on Richard. So that's one of the frameworks. Another thing we mentioned is that as we were working together, I didn't have so much a brief, but I sort of understood Joe, and Joe sort of understood my work. So there was a complete there was never would I ever dare say it's not my place to suggest, even in a positive sense, I would not suggest for Joe to write anything specific. If I were, let's say if I'm walking, all three of us are walking in the street, and I noticed that Richard said something to me that's outside of Joe's earshot, then I would repeat that if I thought it was interesting from where we did. But there's no way that Joe is completely independent and I'm completely independent. So how did that work? This is to answer the question, how did the process, the making of change the product in itself? I think that it was reflected because at the very beginning we knew sort of, Joe mentioned it was we were working on a meta level, where it was not just the subject, it was the experience of this project being developed, all mingled in together. So we were aware of what the process, we were aware of the mechanism of the process, and I think being aware of that, we also allowed that all the time to inform our present and our short-term steps. I don't think that the long-term steps change. That the long-term target was always the same. It was just that this poetic biography of Richard. So that never changed. But there could be anything that say on one visit out to New Jersey, would find out that Richard would need some Social Security papers to be done. Very practical things. That informed our next visit, either that week or 10 days. That informed sort of the target, a practical target for our next spending a day with Richard. We'd go out and visit him, and then we had to go to a government administration office and do something. So that was because the week before, that time before, we had realized, or Joe had realized, that Richard needed some papers to be able to do something, to get some more benefits or to do something. So the process was altered in practical ways like that. Now, conceptually, how was the process altered as we were working on it? I think we were both at the same time sort of not at the edge of the precipice, but at the edge of the world as the world was becoming bigger. So it wasn't so much a precipice, but we sort of did with our past knowledge and experience. We kept on putting a foot forward just as the ground was being built, we kept on doing that. So we sort of always left open how to work on the short-term level, even though the target and the goal was always clear, and that never changed actually. So that's how I think of it at both the practical level and also more the conceptual level, the way we've allowed events of reality to intrude into the art project, if you want, but also elements of our own understanding of our own project. Like we would work for 1 month, Joe would write something, I would read Joe's writing, and maybe the week after that I would come back with an edit of photos, and then we would, all of a sudden Joe and me would be looking at the writing and photos, and we'd say, oh, we've gotten somewhere. And without consciously saying we've gotten here and now we're going to direct it this way, but that did completely inform our next visit. So that's how I would answer that.
Mm. So Joe, how would you answer? To what extent is the creative, the making process for you as a writer part of the thinking process?
Well, it's very much a part of it, in the sense that I would this particular project for me is a little bit different from other things that I've done, in the sense that this really is a exercise in what I would call, for want of a better term, photo-poetic journalism. So the first part of it is not really a writing process at all. It's just a experience and an information gathering process. So I'd say I first met Richard in the summer of, was it 2011 or 2012? I'm bad with dates. I think it's 2011. It is 2011. And so I would carry around notebooks with me and take note of our conversations. Once I sort of crossed the threshold and decided I was interested enough in this man to try to write something about him. But I didn't really do anything other than take notes and try to throw myself into the experience. And so Michel got involved in that time period, but I would say there was at least 6, but probably more likely 9 months of that alone happening before I decided that I was ready to start to tackle. So if I first met Richard in the summer of 2011, I think I first sat down to try to write a little about him in March of 2012. Now, what is always true for me is that writing, very much until you actually start that process, you don't really know what it is that you're doing. Just sort of collecting tidbits of information, jotting things down that are striking to you. But particularly in a process like this, the most important thing is what's the voice, what's the tone of the material going to be. And so first you experience it, and then you find a way to describe or write about the experience. And in the finding a way to write about it or describe it, you definitely learn a lot more about what the experience means, because writing is just, for me at least, is just another form of thought. You don't really, I very rarely, well, sometimes I'll think through something completely before I write it, but that's very much the exception. More often than not, I'll experience something, understand pieces of it that are prominent or important, but not necessarily understand how it all fits together. But the most important quality that comes from the writing is the voice of the material and the tone of the subject matter, and that is not something that happens until you actually sit down to bang it out.
Do either of you ever work with any kind of music present?
You answer first.
Up to a point. There were a couple of times in writing this where music was very important to me. The beginning, the intro, which I didn't write first. I came back and wrote that later. There are two pieces of music in particular that every time I listened to them, they would put me into the mood. They would just sort of transport me into the frame of mind that I wanted to be in order to write the book. Because they were pieces of music that I actually directly associated with Richard, they sort of kind of helped set the tone, and they were also very important in terms of the sort of rhythm or the pacing that I wanted to try to get in the flow of the book. So yes, but it's more like
Which pieces?
well, the introduction is largely based on a Cole Porter song, "Begin the Beguine," and then the historical narrative about Richard's experience in the war and the post-war years is based on a piece of music called "Woodchopper's Ball," which is actually referred to in the book. Richard, among all his other interests in life, not only was he a photographer, but he was an avid
Jazz aficionado.
Not an aficionado, but he was very much in that milieu in New York, and so both those pieces of music are kind of important parts of his character. But oftentimes, it's more like you listen to it, you get ready, and then you got to shut the music off to get started on your own, because, and not unlike when I'm deep into a book, for the 2 years that I was most intensively working on this book, I didn't really read anything else. I really had to shut out any other kind of written work to keep it from spilling over too much into what I was shooting for or what I wanted to do. And that even went to, at some point, a dear cousin of mine gave me a copy of a book. I forget the name of it, but it's a very good, Stuart something. It's a book written by a really talented UK writer about a homeless man that he became friendly with. But I just found I couldn't read it while I was deeply immersed in my own efforts to tell this story. So,
do you feel like it would have impacted?
Yeah, it would have been I think, inappropriate intrusion in our attempt to kind of tell Richard's story. Because what does Richard's story have to do with some bloke, living on the street in the UK? I mean, there's some obvious similarity, but not really. So,
Michel, what about you with music? Do you work with presence?
Well, about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I stopped listening to music while I'm working. Well, when I'm shooting, I don't listen to music. When I'm shooting outside in the studio with Richard, obviously, it's not a possibility. And then even when I'm shooting, sometimes in the studio situation, I would not put music on. I want complete concentration. I want to be able to whisper to somebody in the studio and they'd be able to listen to me. I don't want to have to talk above the music. But also, so that's one side of the situation. The other side is that if I'm going to listen to music, it's either a piece of music that I'm going to put on that I really like, If it's going to be more random, it's going to be a radio station, but I'm going to choose a radio station. It's going to be something I really like. And most of the time, it's going to be a piece of music that I really, really like, and I can't, I'm not willing anymore to divide my attention. So if it's music is playing, part of my energy and my being is going to be captive because it's good music. So no, I don't listen to music. No. For that, I mean, I love music. Because I love it, I don't listen to it. Because I just can't do two things at the same time. I don't want to do two things at the same time.
Do you have any plans to collaborate beyond this particular project?
Yeah, The Life and Times of Joe Lamport.
For me now, I mean, I would love to have a chance to work again with Michel, but right now I just don't. I've had to turn my attention to other more remunerative occupations than writing mock epic poetry. So the opportunities will hopefully present themselves. Michel has a bunch of really exciting projects that he's involved in, and whether we can produce a book again together or not, we'll see.
I think and I know that this project with Richard Musto is far from being finished. So I know that Joe and me's collaboration on this is not finished. It's either going to be some more marketing, some more this, or some more that. So so we'll keep on I know we'll keep on collaborating on this, but I think this thing will still keep on. You used the word seeding before. This will still keep on giving, and we're going to have to respond to it. And then our response, like this interview itself, is part of the project. Yeah, it's part of the project. And I think there will still be different developments that hopefully will happen, whether we initiate them or not. So I think that definitely collaboration on this is far, that I'm sure is far from being finished. I don't know what forms it'll take from now in the future. And as for other projects and collaboration, yeah, we'll see as both of us get a little bit of time, breathing time.
One thing I certainly prize about this experience is I had worked on a project with another visual artist, but more was a book that I wrote, or a translation that I wrote that then I got an artist to do illustrations for. So it was kind of after the fact and not so much in the mix of the creative process. And to me, it was a great experience. I mean, sometimes, Manning, it's never easy to mesh completely with another person, but the benefits so far outweighed whatever the compromises were, in the sense that just learned a tremendous amount about seeing through working with Michel, and because and to have that incredible richness of the library of images that he assembled over the course of the 2 years, to be able to draw on that material as part of my own reference, because it really, what better reference is there for documenting the life of this man than this incredible collection of images. So I can't there's some projects that I am interested in the writing that are more things that I would tackle on my own, but for anything like this, a sort of non-fictional project, what a wonderful way to work as a writer, to be partnered with a visual artist. It's a great thing to be able to do. Yeah.
Finally, where is Richard now? Because he's still alive, isn't he? And his story continues, really.
His story continues. He, in fact, if you stay another hour, there's a good chance he's going to call, because it's the middle of the month. But he is in. He's been very fortunate in being able to get off the streets, and he's living in a home in Atlantic City. Has been sort of brought into what I would characterize as a not very traditional family setting, in a very warm and loving household where he has been, become an integral member of the family. And how that happens to a 90-year-old man living on the street, it's quite a remarkable thing. It's not formally actually part of the book because this all happened really after we published the first edition of the book. But you can read about it on our blog. Tells the story of finally how Richard got rescued off of the streets of Manhattan. So,
right. Thank you very much, Michel, and thank you very much, Joe, for talking about the book today.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Yeah.